Well, good morning. This is Plant Smart Living with Farmer Fred. Really glad you could join me today out here in the vegetable garden. It's a beautiful day here in the early springtime. Well, sometimes I get questions from subscribers, and so I thought I would take some time to answer this really good question here. They ask, any recommendations on plants that are good for a beginner gardener? So that's a really great question, and I hope to do my best to answer that important question. So thanks for joining me today out here in the vegetable garden. So this subscriber also writes here, I found your channel last month and have been truly enjoying it. I would greatly appreciate some guidance if you have the time. I recently moved from a city to owning 5 acres in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, Zone 4. Too early to start planting as we just received a foot of snow on Saturday and it's snowing even more as I write this. I would love to start growing my own food, but I have no idea where to begin and took your comment to heart. Start small and build off your successes. Any recommendations on plants that are good for a beginner gardener? Also, we have a lot of wild rabbits sharing the land with us. Is that a concern? And so that's a really great question. At the end of all of our videos, I have the garden tip from Plant Smart Living. Start small and build off your successes. And that can be gardening can be quite overwhelming. It's a big learning curve. And so I have found over the years to start small and build off your successes. For instance, if you were to start to really build a big garden for yourself, it could become overwhelming and frustrated. There's a lot to learn about how to deal with pests and fertilizer and everything, and so it can really get overwhelming. Now, my daughter Julie, where she lives, she has a 4 foot by 8 foot raised garden bed. She has only one of them. And so every year she plants some vegetables there in her little 4 foot by 8 foot raised bed. Now, you could also start with 1 or 2 of those raised beds, but with her raised bed there of that size, it's surprising that the yield that she gets or the harvest she gets from just having a few plants. And if you're a beginner gardener, I would recommend also just buying some transplants. Go to a local nursery and buy yourself transplants. It's a lot easier that way. I mean, that's something I even do. I don't start a whole lot of plants or seeds indoors. I buy a lot of transplants, and then I also direct sow a lot of my seeds out in the garden. But for a beginner gardener, you could buy a couple tomato plants. You want to make sure that you buy the bush type tomato plants. They're the determinate tomato plants, they're called. They only get about 36 inches high, maybe 42 inches. And you could buy yourself a couple heavy-duty tomato cages to support them. That's what I use here in my garden. They're about $5 a piece. They're a good heavy-duty cage I would recommend to buy, not the cheaper ones for only a couple dollars. But a couple tomato plants you could put in your garden. Also, I have some green bell pepper plants I put in my daughter's garden. Maybe 2 pepper plants, maybe 3. And they're a great pepper. There's different types of pepper plants out there that you might want to purchase. Depends on your own taste. You could also get a basil plant. Basil's something easy to grow. And in the early spring, you have your cool weather crops, and then you have your warmer weather crops. Your tomatoes and peppers, as I spoke about, they're a warmer weather crop. You want to make sure at least when your last frost date is, maybe wait a week before you plant your tomatoes and peppers. That's what I do here in my garden. Also, anything that has a root or a fruit, you know, like a tomato or pepper plants, you want to make sure you get a good 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. Now your leafy greens, you know, your cool weather crops, you could plant some lettuce. You could get lettuce transplants or some Swiss chard transplants. Behind me under my row cover, I recently bought some kale transplants. I get them from Ray's Nursery locally. I get like a 6-pack. It only cost me $1.60, and they have a very good, they're very reasonable there. You could also buy a pack of seeds if you wanted to, and try planting some lettuce out there yourself. It's pretty easy to grow, or Swiss chard. You know, for a couple dollars you could buy a pack of Swiss chard seeds, which would last you a couple years. But you know, the Swiss chard is one of my favorites because it's a pick and come again, and so as long as you continually pick the outer leaves, you know, it'll continue to harvest right through the season. But like I said earlier, you can also buy those kale transplants or seedlings, or even your Swiss chard seedlings. That makes it, you know, easier for the beginner, and there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. And you want to make sure your garden bed is filled with you know, some good compost. You could get some topsoil and amend it with composted leaf mulch. I use composted leaf mulch that's amended with topsoil, but you could also, I use my alfalfa pellets or alfalfa meal. I also use soy meal, and I get those 50-pound bags from local horse feed stores, and they add a good, well-balanced, organic, slow-release fertilizer to your soil. Because every year your plants take up nutrients from the soil, and so it's good to be able to replenish your soil on a yearly basis with some of those nutrients, such as the alfalfa meal or even your soy meal. There are other, you know, organic fertilizers out there on the market that you could use, but I try to emphasize organic growing here, and I have very little problems with garden pests like your cabbage butterfly or your aphids. I do grow a lot of my brassica plants like kale and collard greens underneath my row covers so that they don't get attacked by the cabbage worm that or the butterfly, that, you know, that little yellowish whitish butterfly that flies around your garden. They lay eggs under your leaves, and then they turn into caterpillars that just devour your plants. But anyhow, as a beginner gardener, that's what I would do. Start small and build off your successes. Start with 1 or 2 4-foot by 8-foot raised beds. Fill it with some good compost. You know, make sure you get a good 6 to 8 hours of sunlight for your vegetables that bear, you know, have fruit or root, or your leafy greens can get away with 4 to 6 hours of sunlight. And you can also grow most of these vegetables in pots too, you know, on your deck or balcony. You just want to make sure that they're large enough pots when you plant your vegetables. You know, like if you plant tomatoes in pots, you want to make sure they're at least a 5-gallon bucket. Same thing with peppers, you know, you make sure they're 5-gallon buckets. You know, leafy greens, they're a shallow root system, so you don't need something quite as large for that. But anyhow, I hope this answers your question, and if you have any comments, feel free to leave them in the section below. And you can also visit us at plantsmartliving.com, and there you can learn more about gardening and how you can also reclaim your health by adopting a whole food, plant-based lifestyle. Well, anyhow, I hope you have a wonderful day today. Thanks for joining me out in the garden. So until next time, this is Plant Smart Living with Farmer Fred.